Want meat? Eat it off the ground. Those were the words my own son said to me at a Sunday family barbecue, and for a few seconds, nobody at the table seemed to think there was anything wrong with them. I wish I could tell you that I immediately stood up for myself. I wish I could tell you that I said something clever that put everyone in their place. But I didn't. I simply stood there, holding my paper plate, staring at the piece of steak lying in the grass near my shoes. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and until that afternoon, I still believed that no matter how distant my son had become, somewhere beneath the coldness, the little boy I raised was still there. The barbecue was supposed to be a family gathering. Brian and his wife Ashley hosted one every summer in their backyard outside Columbus, Ohio. Their house sat on nearly 2 acres of land, with a large wooden deck overlooking a stretch of green lawn. It was the kind of place families gathered to make memories. At least, that was what I used to think. I arrived carrying a bowl of homemade potato salad, the same recipe my late husband Thomas had loved for over 40 years. The driveway was already full. My grandchildren were running through the yard. Music drifted softly from outdoor speakers. People laughed. The smell of grilled burgers and steak floated through the warm afternoon air. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Ashley greeted me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You made it," she said. "Of course," I replied. "Wouldn't miss seeing everyone." She nodded politely before turning away to greet another guest. That small dismissal should have told me something. Instead, I ignored it. I always ignored it. For years, I had convinced myself that every uncomfortable moment was simply a misunderstanding. Every forgotten invitation. Every canceled visit. Every holiday where I somehow ended up sitting at the far end of the table. I kept telling myself families go through phases. I kept believing things would get better. Around 5 o'clock, everyone gathered near the grill. Brian stood proudly beside it, flipping steaks while several neighbors complimented his cooking. He seemed happy, confident, important. I watched him from across the yard and remembered the young man who used to call me every Sunday evening just to check in. I barely recognized him now. When dinner was finally ready, people lined up with paper plates. I waited patiently near the back. There was no reason to rush. When my turn came, I reached for a steak. Before I could place it on my plate, Brian suddenly stepped forward. His hand moved quickly. The steak slipped from the serving tray and landed in the grass. The conversation around us instantly went quiet. Brian looked directly at me. Then he laughed. "Want meat," he said. "Eat it off the ground." A few nervous chuckles followed. Someone looked away. Someone else pretended to be busy with their drink. Nobody said a word. Nobody told him to stop. Nobody told him he was wrong. I looked down at the steak resting on the lawn. Then I looked back at my son. Ashley stood nearby holding a glass of iced tea. There was a faint smile on her face. Not surprise. Not embarrassment. Satisfaction. That hurt more than the words themselves. The silence stretched for several seconds. Long enough for everyone to feel uncomfortable. Long enough for everyone to know a line had been crossed. I bent down slowly, not to pick up the steak, just to retrieve the napkin that had fallen beside it. Then I straightened my back. "Excuse me," I said softly. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I set my empty plate on a nearby table and walked toward my car. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. Nobody tried to stop me. 20 minutes later, I pulled into my driveway. The house felt quiet. Too quiet. I sat alone in my kitchen as the evening sunlight faded through the window above the sink. Thomas's old coffee mug still sat on the shelf, where he had left it years ago. I stared at it for a long time. Then I finally allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding for far too long. How did my son become someone capable of treating me that way? The next morning, I got dressed before sunrise. At 7:30, I walked into a downtown bank carrying a leather folder that had remained untouched for nearly 3 years. Inside was something my husband had left behind. Something Brian knew nothing about. And as I sat across from the branch manager, listening to words that would change everything, I realized the worst mistake my son had made was assuming I had nothing left. The branch manager introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. He looked to be in his early 50s, with silver at his temples and the kind of calm expression that comes from spending decades handling other people's secrets. He shook my hand warmly and gestured toward a private office. I followed him down a quiet hallway, carrying the worn leather folder Thomas had asked me never to throw away. For nearly 3 years after my husband's passing, I had left it untouched in the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser. At the time, I had not been emotionally ready to look at anything connected to legal documents or financial matters. Grief has a way of making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Daniel closed the office door and sat across from me. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, "I was wondering when you might come in." His words caught me off guard. I blinked. "You were expecting me?" He nodded. "Your husband made very specific arrangements. He believed that someday you would need to know about them." My fingers tightened around the folder. Suddenly, I could hear Thomas's voice in my memory. Not from his final days. From years earlier.
Calm. Steady.
Practical. He had always prepared for things long before anyone else thought they were necessary. While I worried about today, Thomas was usually planning for 5 years from now. Daniel opened a file and slid several documents across the desk. 3 years ago, shortly before his passing, your husband established a trust account. I stared at him. A trust account? Yes. He folded his hands. One that remains entirely under your control. For a moment, I simply looked at the papers without speaking. Thomas had handled most of our investments. Not because he excluded me, but because numbers fascinated him in a way they never fascinated me. We discussed everything, yet he always enjoyed managing the details himself. "I do not understand," I admitted. Daniel offered. A sympathetic smile. "Your husband wanted to make certain you would always have options." Options. The word lingered in my mind. Lately, I had felt as though my options were disappearing one by one. Every family gathering seemed to remind me that I no longer belonged. Every conversation with Brian felt shorter than the one before. Somehow, without realizing it, I had allowed myself to become a guest in my own family. Daniel continued speaking. "There are also instructions attached to the trust." He handed me another document. The handwriting on the first page stopped me cold. It was Thomas's. Instantly recognizable. The same careful penmanship that had filled birthday cards, anniversary notes, and grocery lists for over 40 years. My eyes blurred slightly as I began reading. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that made you question your place in the family. I know you. You will spend years giving people the benefit of the doubt. Longer than they deserve." I swallowed hard. That sounded exactly like him. He knew me better than anyone ever had. The letter continued. "You always see the good in people. It is one of the reasons I loved you. But sometimes kindness becomes an invitation for others to take more than they should. If that day ever comes, I need you to remember something. You are not dependent on anyone's approval. Not mine. Not our son's. Not anyone's." I lowered the page and stared at the desk. For months after Thomas died, I had been quietly measuring my worth through other people's treatment of me. If Brian called, I felt valued. If he ignored me, I felt forgotten. If my grandchildren visited, I felt included. If they did not, I felt invisible. Somewhere along the way, I had surrendered too much power. Daniel waited respectfully while I collected myself. Then he opened another file. "There is something else you should know." His tone changed slightly. More serious. More cautious. "Over the past year, there have been multiple inquiries regarding family assets connected to your late husband's estate." I looked up immediately. "What kind of inquiries?" Daniel met my eyes. "Most of them originated from your son." My stomach
Tightened.
The room suddenly felt much smaller. And for the first time since leaving that barbecue, I began to realize that what happened yesterday may not have been an isolated moment of cruelty. It may have been part of something much larger. Daniel's words stayed with me long after I left the bank. Multiple inquiries. Most of them from Brian. I drove home slowly, taking roads I had traveled for decades. Familiar streets. Familiar houses. Familiar places that suddenly felt different. It was strange how a single piece of information could force you to reevaluate years of memories. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer thinking about what my son had become. I was thinking about when the change had started. For a long time, I blamed Ashley for everything.
It was easier that way.
Easier to believe she had somehow transformed the kind young man I raised into a stranger. But as I sat alone at my kitchen table that afternoon, I realized the truth was probably more complicated. Ashley may have opened the door, but Brian had chosen to walk through it himself. I made a cup of coffee and stared out the window. The bird feeder Thomas had installed years ago still hung beside the maple tree. A pair of cardinals landed there almost every morning. He used to point them out whenever we ate breakfast together. "Look at that," he would say. "They always come back." The memory made me smile for a moment before the sadness returned. Families were supposed to come back too. Mine seemed determined to drift farther away each year. As I thought about it, small memories began resurfacing. Things I had dismissed at the time. Things that now looked very different. 3 years earlier, shortly after Thomas passed away, Brian started asking questions about paperwork. At first, I thought he was trying to help. He offered to organize documents. He offered to review bills. He offered to simplify my finances. It sounded thoughtful, responsible, loving, even. Looking back, I noticed something important. He never asked how I was coping. He never asked if I was lonely. He never asked whether I needed emotional support. He only asked about assets, accounts, and property. Then, there was the lake cabin. Thomas had loved that place. We spent nearly every summer there for more than 20 years. After his passing, I suggested keeping it in the family. Brian immediately began discussing its market value. Not the memories. Not the traditions. The value. I remembered feeling surprised at the time. Now I felt something else. Concern. Another memory surfaced. Last Thanksgiving. I had invited everyone to my house. Brian canceled at the last minute. Ashley claimed the children were tired. Later that evening, I saw photographs online showing the entire family gathered at Ashley's sister's home. Everyone was smiling. Everyone looked happy. Everyone had been included except me. I remembered staring at those photographs for a long time. Not angry, just confused. I kept wondering what I had done wrong. The answer, I was beginning to realize, might have been nothing at all. Sometimes exclusion is not punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. The more isolated a person becomes, the easier they are to ignore. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The screen displayed an unexpected name. Lily, my granddaughter. I answered immediately. "Hello, sweetheart." There was a brief pause before she spoke. "Grandma, are you okay?" My chest tightened. Lily was 19. Kind-hearted. Observant. Different from the rest of them in many ways. "I am fine," I said. "Why do you ask?" Another pause. Then a quiet sigh. "Because what happened on Sunday was awful." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, "Did everyone think so?" "Most people did," she admitted. "They just did not say anything." I closed my eyes. Somehow that hurt almost as much as the incident itself. Not because people agreed with Brian, because they were willing to stay silent. Lily's voice softened. "Grandma, there is something you need to know. Dad and Mom have been talking about money a lot lately. More than usual." My grip tightened around the phone. "What kind of money?" "Family money," she replied quietly. "And I think they believe something belongs to them that they do not actually control." Suddenly, Daniel's warning echoed in my mind. Multiple inquiries. Family assets. My son. Asking questions he was never authorized to answer. A chill moved through me. For the first time, the pieces were beginning to fit together. And the picture they formed was far more troubling than I had imagined. After my call with Lily ended, I remained at the kitchen table long after the coffee in my cup had gone cold. Outside, the afternoon sun slowly moved across the backyard, casting long shadows over the grass Thomas used to mow every Saturday morning. For years, I had looked at that yard and seen stability, security, a life built carefully over decades. Now I looked at it and wondered how much of that security had existed only because Thomas had been there to protect it. I thought back to the early years of our marriage. We were not wealthy. Far from it. When Brian was born, We lived in a small two-bedroom house with peeling paint and a furnace that seemed to break every winter. Thomas worked long hours. I worked part-time whenever I could. Every dollar mattered. We skipped vacations. We postponed home repairs. We drove used cars long after most people would have replaced them. Not because we enjoyed sacrifice, but because we believed we were building something for our future and for our son. As Brian grew older, our lives improved. Thomas started a successful construction company. We invested carefully. We saved consistently. We purchased the lake cabin. Eventually, we bought additional property. None of it happened overnight. Every asset represented years of effort, patience, and discipline. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of bills spread between us. Thomas would smile and say, "One day all of this will give Brian opportunities we never had." At the time, I thought that was exactly what good parents were supposed to do. Looking back now, I wonder if we gave too much without teaching enough gratitude. The phone rang again shortly before dinner. This time it was Brian. His name appeared on the screen, and for several seconds I simply stared at it. Normally, I would have answered immediately. That was what mothers do. No matter how disappointed they are, they answer. But something inside me had changed. I let the call go to voicemail. Few moments later, a message notification appeared. "Mom, call me when you get this. We need to talk." I read the message twice. Not "Are you okay?" Not "I am sorry about Sunday." Not "I regret what happened." "We need to talk." The wording felt transactional, practical, as though he had an agenda waiting for me. I set the phone aside without responding. An hour later, another message arrived. This one from Ashley. "Hope everything is okay. Brian has been trying to reach you." The concern sounded polite on the surface, but it felt strangely hollow. For years, Ashley had mastered the art of saying the right words while meaning something entirely different. She rarely argued openly. She preferred subtler methods, exclusions, omissions, quiet redirections. Looking back, I could see the pattern more clearly than ever. Family dinners moved without informing me. Vacations planned without invitations. Decisions made before I even knew discussions were happening. None of it seemed significant in isolation. Together, however, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Around 7 that evening, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Lily stood on the porch holding a small backpack. Her expression looked nervous. "I hope it is okay that I came by," she said. "Of course it is." I stepped aside and welcomed her inside. She sat at the kitchen table while I prepared tea. For a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. College classes.
Her summer job.
The weather. Then she reached into her backpack and removed her phone. "Grandma," she said quietly, "there's something I think you should see." Her voice carried a seriousness that immediately caught my attention. She unlocked the screen and placed the phone on the table between us. As the video began to play, I saw the familiar backyard from Sunday's gathering. Conversations, laughter, people carrying plates. Then the camera shifted slightly. My heart sank. Whatever Lily had recorded, I already knew it would answer questions I had not yet been brave enough to ask. The video lasted less than 3 minutes, but by the time it ended, I felt as though I had watched years of hidden truths unfold in front of me. Lily had not recorded the gathering intentionally. She had been filming a short clip of her younger cousins playing in the yard when the camera accidentally captured a conversation near the grill. The image shook slightly as people moved around, but the voices were clear. Brian's voice came first. "Once we get everything transferred, it will not matter anymore." Then Ashley laughed softly. "The sooner the better. We cannot keep waiting forever." I felt my stomach tighten. Lily looked at me carefully. "There is more." She tapped the screen again. The video continued. Someone asked what they were talking about. Ashley answered without hesitation. "The properties. The cabin.
The trust.
All of it will eventually be ours anyway." A few people chuckled. Another voice said something I could not quite make out. Then Brian responded. "Mom does not even understand half of what Dad left behind." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they were dismissive. as though I were no longer a person with judgment or experience, as though I were simply an obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. Lily lowered the phone. Grandma, I almost deleted the video. Then I watched it again later that night. I nodded slowly. Thank you for showing me. She looked relieved. I was worried you would be upset. I am upset, I admitted. But not with you. For several moments we sat quietly. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. The kitchen clock ticked above the stove. Ordinary sounds that somehow felt much louder than usual. Finally, Lily spoke again. There is something else I overheard a few weeks ago. I looked up. What was it? She hesitated. Dad has been meeting with lenders. My attention sharpened immediately. Lenders? She nodded. I did not think much about it at first. But lately he has been talking about expanding a business project. Mom keeps saying they need more capital. Capital. Another word that sounded harmless until placed beside everything else I had learned. Family assets. Property inquiries. Conversations about trusts. A sudden interest in ownership. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Do they have financial problems? I asked. Lily shrugged. I do not know. They do not talk about details around me anymore. That answer told me more than she realized. Families rarely become secretive when things are going well. After Lily left that evening, I sat alone in the living room with the video replaying in my mind. The house felt different now. Less like a place filled with memories and more like a place where answers might finally emerge. Around 9 o'clock, I retrieved the leather folder from my bedroom. For the first time since visiting the bank, I carefully reviewed every document Daniel had shown me. Most of it was legal language. Trust provisions. Asset protections. Conditions established years earlier. Then I found something I had overlooked during my emotional reaction to Thomas's letter. A separate page attached behind the trust documents. My husband's signature appeared at the bottom. I read the page once, then twice. The wording was precise. If any beneficiary attempted to gain control of protected family assets through deception, coercion, or misuse of authority, certain protections would automatically activate. My pulse quickened. Thomas had not merely created a trust. He had anticipated specific risks. Risks serious enough to require safeguards. Suddenly, I understood why Daniel had seemed concerned. This was not simply about inheritance. It was about preserving something Thomas believed could be threatened. I looked toward the photograph resting on the mantel above the fireplace. Thomas smiled back from a family vacation taken nearly 10 years earlier. His arm rested around my shoulders. Brian stood beside us, younger then, happier. I wondered what Thomas would think if he could see us now. Then another realization settled over me. For days I had been reacting to events, gathering information, connecting pieces. But that phase was ending. The questions were finally leading somewhere. And the next step would require more than observation. It would require finding out exactly why my son seemed so desperate to gain control of something that was never truly his. The following morning, I called Daniel and asked if we could meet again. He agreed. Immediately. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from him in the same quiet office at the bank. This time, however, I arrived with specific questions. I no longer felt like a confused widow trying to understand paperwork. I felt like someone finally beginning to understand the game being played around her. Daniel listened carefully as I explained what Lily had shown me. He remained professional, but I noticed a subtle change in his expression when I mentioned the conversations about property and trust assets. When I finished speaking, he opened another folder and reviewed several pages. Mrs. Sullivan, he said carefully, there are limits to what I can disclose without formal authorization, but I can tell you this. Over the past 18 months, there have been repeated attempts to determine what authority your son would have over certain family assets if circumstances changed. I frowned. What circumstances? Daniel paused. For example, if you voluntarily transferred control, if you moved into assisted living, if you became unable to manage your affairs. Situations like that. A chill settled over me. Suddenly, dozens of small conversations from recent years came rushing back. Ashley casually mentioning retirement communities. Brian suggesting I should simplify my life. Repeated comments about how difficult it must be to maintain my home alone. At the time, I thought they were expressing concern. Now I was not so sure. Were they successful? I asked quietly. Daniel shook his head.
No.
The trust was specifically designed to prevent unauthorized control. Relief washed through me, but it did not last long. If Brian and Ashley had been trying for 18 months, then what happened recently was not impulsive. It was part of a much larger plan. After leaving the bank, I drove to the lake cabin. I had not visited in nearly a year. The 2-hour drive gave me plenty of time to think. By the time I arrived, the sky was covered with soft gray clouds drifting across the water. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered. White siding, green shutters, a wooden dock stretching into the lake. Thomas loved this place. We celebrated birthdays here, family reunions, summer, weekends filled with fishing, board games, and long conversations on the porch. Standing there, I realized something painful. Brian no longer saw the cabin as a place filled with memories. He saw it as an asset, a number on a spreadsheet, a source of money. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust covered some surfaces, but everything remained largely unchanged. Thomas's old fishing hat still hung beside the entryway. His favorite chair remained near the fireplace. For a few moments, I simply stood there absorbing the silence. Then I noticed something unexpected. A stack of mail sat on the kitchen counter. Most of it was junk mail forwarded from a local post office box. But one envelope immediately caught my attention. It was addressed to Brian. My pulse quickened. The envelope had apparently been delivered here by mistake months earlier. I hesitated before examining it. The return address belonged to a commercial lending company. Through the small transparent window, I could see part of a document inside. One phrase stood out clearly. Pending collateral review. I stared at the envelope for several seconds. Collateral.
Property.
Loans. Suddenly Lily's comments about lenders made perfect sense. Brian was not simply curious about family assets.
He needed them.
Whatever project he and Ashley were pursuing required money. A significant amount of money. And somewhere along the way, they had convinced themselves that my husband's legacy already belonged to them. As I stood alone in that quiet cabin, looking out at the lake Thomas loved so much, I realized the situation was even more serious than I had imagined. And for the first time, I began wondering how far Brian might be willing to go if he discovered that everything he was counting on remained completely out of his reach. I spent the night at the cabin, not because I was afraid to drive home, but because I needed time to think. The rain arrived shortly after sunset, tapping softly against the windows while the lake disappeared beneath a gray curtain of mist. I sat in Thomas's old chair with a blanket over my lap and the lending company envelope resting on the coffee table beside me. For years, I had assumed that patience would solve most family problems.
Give people time.
Give them grace. Give them another chance. But patience only works when the other person is acting in good faith. What if they're not? That question followed me into the next morning. On my drive back to Columbus, my phone rang twice. Brian, then Ashley. I let both calls go unanswered. Shortly before noon, another message arrived. Mom, we are worried about you. Please call us. I stared at the words at a red light. Worried. The timing felt almost ironic. I had spent years hoping they would show genuine concern. Yet now that I was asking questions and becoming less available, concern suddenly appeared. By the time I reached home, a different feeling had replaced much of my sadness.
Clarity.
The pieces were fitting together. Not perfectly yet, but enough to reveal the shape of what was happening. Around 3 o'clock, Daniel called. Mrs. Sullivan, there is an update you should know about. His voice carried the same careful professionalism as always. What kind of update? I asked. Someone contacted our office this morning requesting information about trust administration procedures. I already knew the answer before he said it. Brian. Yes. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, he was searching for a way in. Searching for a shortcut. Searching for leverage. Did he receive anything? Absolutely not. Daniel paused. However, I think it may be time to move forward with the next step your husband anticipated. My attention sharpened immediately. What next step? A formal family review meeting. The words hung in the air between us. I remembered seeing references to such a meeting in the trust documents. At the time, I had not paid much attention. Now I understood its significance. Thomas had created a mechanism allowing all relevant parties to gather with legal representation whenever questions about trust administration arose. It was designed to prevent misunderstandings and establish facts clearly. You think it is necessary? I asked. Based on everything you have shared with me, Daniel replied, yes. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly. The photographs on the walls seemed different now. In one picture, Brian was 10 years old, proudly holding a fish he caught at the lake. In another, he stood beside Thomas during his high school graduation. There were birthdays, Christmas mornings, family vacations, evidence of a life filled with love. I studied each photograph carefully. Somewhere along the way, the relationship captured in those frames had changed. Yet despite everything, I still did not want revenge. That realization surprised me. I wanted honesty, accountability,
Truth.
but not revenge. Late that evening, Lily called again. Grandma? Hello, sweetheart. She sounded nervous. Something happened. My stomach tightened immediately. What is it? Dad and Mom had an argument. I sat down at the kitchen table.
About what?
Money. She lowered her voice. I was not supposed to hear it, but Dad kept saying the financing would fall apart if they could not secure additional collateral. The word hit me immediately. Collateral. The same word I had seen on the envelope at the cabin. Lily continued. Mom said they were counting on the properties. Dad said they should already have access by now. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing in my mind for days. Lily, do you think they expected me to give them control? No, she answered quietly. I think they expected you to stop asking questions. After we hung up, I sat alone in the darkened kitchen. The clock ticked softly above the stove. Outside, a summer breeze moved through the trees. For the first time, I understood exactly why Thomas had built so many protections into the trust. He had not been planning for financial trouble. He had been planning for human nature. And somewhere across town, my son still believed he was one signature away from getting everything he wanted. What he did not know was that the meeting Daniel had recommended was already being scheduled. And once everyone sat down at that table, assumptions would no longer matter. Only facts would. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon at the law office that had handled Thomas's estate for years. Daniel arranged everything. Formal notices were sent. Relevant documents were prepared. By the time the date arrived, I felt surprisingly calm. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because uncertainty was finally coming to an end. For weeks, pieces of information had been gathering around me like storm clouds. Now the storm was about to break. I arrived 15 minutes early. The conference room was large, but simple. A polished wooden table occupied the center. Legal folders sat neatly arranged at each seat. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking downtown Columbus. I chose a chair near the end of the table and waited quietly. A few minutes later, Brian and Ashley entered together.
The moment they saw me, both seemed surprised.
Not angry, not hostile.
Surprised.
As though they had expected me to avoid the meeting entirely. Brian forced a smile. Mom. I nodded politely. Brian. Ashley offered a carefully controlled expression. It is good to see you. I simply returned the greeting without elaborating. For years, I would have rushed to smooth over the tension. Not anymore. Soon Daniel entered alongside another attorney from the estate firm. Everyone took their seats. The atmosphere felt formal enough that casual conversation quickly disappeared. Daniel opened a folder. Thank you all for attending. Today's meeting concerns questions that have recently arisen regarding trust administration, family assets, and beneficiary expectations. Brian shifted slightly in his chair. Ashley folded her hands. Daniel continued. Before we begin discussing current matters, there is a document Thomas Sullivan directed us to present if specific circumstances ever occurred. The room became noticeably quieter. I already knew the document existed. Brian clearly did not. Daniel removed a sealed envelope from the folder. The handwriting on the front belonged to Thomas. Even from across the table, I recognized it immediately. My heart tightened. For a brief moment, it felt as though my husband had somehow stepped back into the room. Daniel carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several pages. This letter was written approximately 6 months before Thomas's passing, he explained. Then he began reading. Thomas's words filled the room.
Calm.
Thoughtful.
Precise. He spoke about family.
Responsibility. Character. He wrote about the difference between inheritance and entitlement. He explained that wealth should serve relationships, not replace them. As Daniel continued reading, I watched Brian's expression slowly change. The confidence he carried into the room began fading. Then Daniel reached the section that mattered most. Thomas wrote that if any beneficiary attempted to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence another family member in pursuit of trust assets, additional protective provisions would immediately become active. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. Those provisions included the suspension of certain future distributions until a full legal review could be completed. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Brian stared at the table. Ashley looked toward the attorney. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked carefully. Daniel answered without emotion. "It means several planned transfers cannot proceed until concerns regarding beneficiary conduct are fully resolved." I saw Ashley's posture stiffen. Brian looked genuinely confused. "Transfers?" he asked. Daniel opened another folder. Over the past 18 months, multiple inquiries and requests were submitted regarding trust-controlled properties. Several requests referenced anticipated asset access that does not currently exist. The room grew still again. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Facts were replacing assumptions. For the first time, I realized how much of Brian's future planning may have depended upon expectations rather than reality. Daniel continued presenting documentation. Dates. Requests. Correspondence. Each item added another piece to the picture. Gradually, it became impossible to deny what had happened. Someone had been counting on control they never possessed. Someone had built plans around an inheritance that remained protected. As the meeting moved forward, I noticed something unexpected. I no longer felt angry. The anger had burned away days earlier. What remained was clarity. Across the table sat 2 people who believed they understood the situation. Now, they were discovering how much they had misunderstood. And the meeting was not even over yet. The final portion of the meeting lasted less than 30 minutes, yet it changed the course of several lives. After the attorneys finished presenting the documents, nobody spoke for a long time. The confidence Brian and Ashley had carried into the room was gone. In its place sat uncertainty, questions, consequences they had never expected to face. Finally, Brian cleared his throat. "There has to be some mistake." Daniel calmly shook his head. "There is no mistake. The trust functions exactly as Thomas intended." Brian looked toward me. For the first time since entering the room, he seemed less focused on assets and more focused on the reality sitting across from him. His mother. The person he had spent months treating as an obstacle instead of family. "Mom," he began carefully, "I did not know any of this." The words hung in the air. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part remembered every ignored phone call, every exclusion, every conversation about property disguised as concern. Whether he knew the legal details was no longer the point. His behavior had already revealed what mattered most. Ashley leaned forward. "We never intended for any of this to happen." It was a familiar sentence, one I had heard in different forms throughout my life. People rarely intend to hurt others at the beginning. They simply keep making choices that eventually lead there. I looked at both of them quietly. Then I spoke. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Neither answered. It was not the trust. It was not the property. It was not even the money. The room remained silent. It was realizing that somewhere along the way I stopped feeling like your mother and started feeling like a problem you were trying to solve. Brian lowered his eyes. Ashley looked away. Nobody argued. Nobody denied it. That told me everything. Daniel closed the final folder. The review process will continue over the coming months. Until then, all trust protections remain active. With that, The meeting officially ended.
Chairs moved.
Papers were gathered.
The attorneys stepped
outside to prepare additional documents. Soon only Brian, Ashley, and I remained in the conference room. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Brian surprised me. "I am sorry." His voice was barely above a whisper. Not dramatic. Not rehearsed. Just tired. "I should have called more. I should have visited more. I should have acted differently." I studied his face. He looked older than he had a few weeks earlier. Worry has a way of doing that.
"Why?"
I asked softly. "Why did it get this far?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I kept telling myself I would make things right later." The answer felt painfully honest. Later. The most dangerous word in families. Later we will visit. Later we will apologize. Later we will spend time together. Then one day there is no later left. I nodded slowly. "Your father used to say that character is revealed by what people do when they think nobody is watching." Brian closed his eyes briefly. He understood exactly what I meant. Before leaving, I reached into my purse and removed a small photograph. It was one Lily had printed from her phone. The image showed the backyard gathering from that Sunday. The grass, the grill, the people standing nearby. I placed it gently on the table. Brian stared at it. He immediately recognized the moment. "I am not showing you this to embarrass you," I said. "I am showing it to you because every important choice starts small. Long before trust documents. Long before meetings. Long before consequences." Neither Brian nor Ashley spoke. They did not need to. The photograph said enough. I stood and gathered my things. For years I believed strength meant enduring whatever others chose to do. Thomas taught me something different, even after he was gone. Real strength means knowing your worth before someone else tries to define it for you. As I walked toward the door, Brian called my name. I turned. "Can we fix this?" he asked. I thought about the question carefully. Then I gave the only honest answer possible. "That depends on what matters more to you. The family you already have, or the things you thought you were going to get." Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk. The city moved around me, as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. People hurried to appointments. Life continued. I took a deep breath and looked up at the clear summer sky. For the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. Not because I had won. Not because anyone had lost. But because I finally understood something Thomas had been trying to teach me all along. Respect cannot be inherited. Trust cannot be demanded. And a person's true wealth is revealed by how they treat the people who love them when there is nothing left to gain.